times one of us just picks. In this instance, Nate picked, and I figured if I was ignorant of Werner Herzog at this point, that going into it, I ought to remain ignorant and let you educate me as we went. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this, Herzog is a fascinating man. His films are generally worth seeing. I've seen a fair amount of them, but he's been producing things very regular since like the late 60s. He works in all sorts of genres, principally dramatic films, at least at first, but he's gotten to be really prolific in documentary films as well. He's done a little acting. Recently, he played a major part on the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian.
What was his part?
He was the guy that hires the Mandalorian to find the Baby Yoda with a very distinct voice.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that's one of the other great things about Herzog is he's got a great voice, very distinctive voice, great for narration, so particularly helpful in his documentaries. He's also crazy in a very entertaining way, which we see in our selections for tonight. We saw two films. One is Aguirre, and I may be totally butchering the accurate pronunciation of that name. It's Aguirre, the Wrath of God, from 1972, which is the film that kind of made him or established him as an international directing star. And then later we watched a short film called Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe from around 1979. But we will talk about both films, starting, of course, with Aguirre. This film is based loosely on historical truth. There is a man by the name of Don Lope de Aguirre, who was a Spanish conquistador in the 16th century. He was part of a large expedition in Latin America looking for El Dorado. The opening title cards in this film state that El Dorado was basically created by the Indians as a distraction to get that's what it implied, to get the conquistadors to go out into the jungle and get lost. But they believed it. They liked the idea of there being a city of gold out in the jungle. And so this particular expedition was a very large one, and its commander at a certain point decided we need to branch off. And they sent a smaller group, something around 40 individuals and some slaves, to kind of scout this specific area. They would end up getting lost and disappear ultimately from the historical record. So we don't know precisely what happened to them. You can make an educated guess. They were probably killed by Indians or starved.
Well, the book or the intro to the film claims that this tale that they are portraying on screen is drawn from the only surviving record, which was the journals kept by a priest that was with them.
Yeah, but
that's the loose claim.
That's the claim, but
that's just the narrative.
Yeah. Like Fargo claimed to have been based on a true story, this is also not accurate. Some of the things in this are drawn from actual accounts of other expeditions, but not from this specific expedition. So because we don't know what happened to the group, there was a lot of freedom for Herzog to make it up, sometimes based on educated guess. But anyway, it's quite the film. You knew basically, I saw it a number of years ago, I can't remember precisely when. I'd heard about it long before that, and it's very strong reputation, including making quite a few top 10 or top 100 lists. Time magazine did one around the turn of the century and listed this in that. But anyway, as we discussed just a moment ago, you knew basically nothing about Herzog or this film.
The only thing I really knew coming into tonight was of that clip that you'd shown that we ended up watching later of Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe. You had told me of that comedically, but I knew nothing of the Aguirre film. Mm-hmm.
So what did you think? What are your first impressions, and then we'll kind of get into it in a little more depth.
I was relatively impressed by the opening. You're
talking about the shot of the caravan shot of all those people
going through the hills.
So it was filmed on location in Peru.
At first I thought it was relatively simple. You just had people progressing, and then they show the cannon, and they're dragging a cannon through these hills, and I'm like, even just from a filmmaking narrative perspective, that's a fair amount of effort. Yeah,
because everything that, this group going through the jungle this time, they'd have to carry everything with them. And this film crew going through the jungle in the early 1970s had the exact same problem. They had to carry everything with them.
Yeah. So I thought those opening shots in the Amazon, especially those mountainous stretches of the Amazon were interesting. It was quite a large group, and then it was interesting to see them gathered in that clearing that they created. where their leader decides that he's going to send out the expedition to go look for El Dorado. The expedition's kind of split up. There's an expedition that's looking for El Dorado, and then there's an expedition that's looking for basically civilization, a Christian civilization.
And to keep an eye on the Indians, that's a constant threat.
Yeah,
because this is not their land. I mean, they've claimed it, but it's full of natives that are not too
friendly.
happy, to have these intruders.
Yeah. So they set out on the boat, and it's interesting, and I spent a certain amount of the film just trying to understand where this was going to go. Like when they're going down the river and one of the boats gets stranded in the eddy.
Yeah,
and
that's an interesting little moment there.
Yeah, and then eventually Don Lope decides to blow it up with a cannon so that they don't have to go rescue it. Or I guess they're already dead, and the leader of their expedition wants to recover the bodies so they can give them Christian burials. So Don Lope shoots it with a cannon and blows it up so that he doesn't have to go rescue their bodies.
Yeah. So when they're, I forget the name, it might have even been, they mentioned Pizarro a number of times. I'm not sure if that was the guy that they were under at the beginning. I don't think it was. They mentioned him and a couple other historical figures early on and later throughout the film. But when they're divided up, Aguirre is not made the commanding officer. There's another guy. His name is Don Pedro de Ursua. He's put in charge, and then de Aguirre is made the second in command. Ursua brings with him his mistress, and the commanding officer is like, I don't really approve of him bringing the mistress, but he insists on bringing the mistress, so she gets to go. And then Aguirre brings his daughter with him. 15-year-old daughter, who I think might actually have been Kinski's daughter. Kinski had a number of daughters, including the actress Natasha Kinski, and I think several of the daughters were models, and she looks like she could have been a model.
Yeah.
So they go, they bring with them a priest, because part of their mission, kind of the excuse, is that they're going to try to Christianize the natives, but they're really, really bad at it in one particular scene.
Yeah.
And then they also bring this guy who's a nobleman.
Don
Fernando, who is... De Guzman, who's the representative of the nobility. For some reason, there was this need for them to be represented on the trip. There's a lot of bizarre... this just really is poorly thought out expedition, and who they bring and what they bring and how they decide to bring it. But those two are sent out as first and second in command with roughly 40 or so people underneath them, including some slaves. They have one person that was a prince, like an Incan prince or something, who they'd kidnapped and are using as a translator.
Yeah.
And then they've got perhaps my favorite character in the film, which is pipe flute guy.
Yeah.
Who they bring with them to provide musical accompaniment as needed.
And it's odd accompaniment.
Yeah. It's not Western style music by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and not even all of it. It doesn't always seem to land a note.
No.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's interesting music though.
Yeah, it is interesting. But they head out first on rafts. One of those rafts gets caught in an eddy, and the crew dies overnight because they're just stuck and they don't have a way to get them out. So the rest of the
it's implied that they're killed by someone,
by Indians,
because
one
of the crew. Well, there's the gunshots that go off at night, and then when they go and are looking at it from the peak the next day, one of the crew and the two oarsmen are gone.
Yeah, so there might have been some kind of rebellion, or maybe the Indians
and they never resolved that either.
Yeah. They're just unlucky fellows.
But they say that one of the crew and then the two oarsmen are gone. And that's when they have that conversation about we need to give them a Christian burial. And Ursua.
Yeah, Ursua wants to cart the bodies, and Aguirre's like, what a freaking waste of time. Like, he doesn't say it, but he more or less sabotages this. He has it blown up, right?
Well, yeah, he actually... So what he tells one of his crew is he says... Oh, the cannon's getting rusty, you better shoot it.
Oh, yeah.
And so the crew member aims the cannon and fires it and blows up the raft with the bodies on it.
Yeah, very early in the expedition. So it starts like New Year's Day, and I think they're split off from the main group like January 2nd or 4th or something like that.
Yeah.
And then it's presented as this...
Well, I think January 8th is when they start their expedition. The 4th is when they make the decision, and they spend the next 4 days building the rafts.
Okay.
And so January 8th is when they actually
get on the rafts
set
and
off.
head off. And very early on, they have this dispute about the bodies and a few other things. And Aguirre shoots Ursula.
Yeah.
And one other guy that is too vocal in his support of Ursula. And he decides that he can't make himself, because it is a mutiny, he can't just declare himself in charge. So he takes the Spanish noble, and they declare him in charge. And in short order, they decide, screw Spain, we're our own country, and we're making him the emperor.
Yeah.
And it's all, so much of this is comical, and this crazy hubris they have, that we're going to find this city of gold, and once we have it, we'll have so much power, we'll all be rich and noblemen, and you'll be a governor, and he'll be the emperor.
As they're going down the river at one point, Guzman says something like, we're already 6 times larger than Spain.
Yeah, than Spain. Because he's looking at us like, I do hereby claim that over there, and that on the other side of the river I also claim, and he's getting really wrapped up in it. Though when he's first declared emperor, he cries.
He's very reluctant.
He's very reluctant. It's like, this is not a good idea, but they feed his ego.
Well, and probably even more comedic than anything else is when Aguirre nominates him to be the leader, everyone's reluctant to vote for him. And they do it by a vote. He says, I nominate him, by raise of hands.
One or two guys like, okay, yeah, he should be the leader.
And then he just has to stare
everybody down. Yeah.
And so then he becomes the leader. But it's funny because he's walking away, and then Guzman says, okay, I make a motion to make Aguirre my second in command, will remain second in command. All in favor. And it's very quick. Every hand goes up
hand's like, yep. No debate on that point.
Yeah.
Of course, his rule does not end well.
Yeah.
Things basically a story of this expedition falling apart.
The expedition is constantly devolving.
Yeah. They're losing people left and right. Indians are shooting them off the side of the shoreline. Bank. And
they even comment several times on the fact that they're getting shot by the natives and they can't even see them.
Yeah. A couple guys decide that they're going to try to leave, so Aguirre has them murdered.
He beheads one. Makes the comment, "This guy's a head taller than me. That's going to have to change."
There's kind of a dark humor throughout the entire thing. There's that moment where this one guy gets shot by this longer. We've been used to having fairly short arrows, but this arrow is particularly long. And he says something before he falls to this, like, "Oh, these big arrows are becoming fashionable." And then he falls into the river.
Yeah, the comedy in this is kind of odd though, because none of it's really, in particular, laugh out loud comedy. You know what I mean?
It's wry.
It's like you said, it's kind of a dark comedy, and yeah, it's a little bit of comedic relief, but it's not something that you're out, sitting there rolling on the floor or audibly laughing about. In fact, I made a comment to Nate before we started recording. This movie reminded me of a joke Robin Williams used to tell. And he said that he was on a German talk show, and the host of the talk show said something along the lines of, "Why do you think there's not so many comedians in Germany?" And Robin Williams, his response was, "Well, did you ever think maybe you killed all the funny people?" And apparently the response from the host with basically no hesitation was, "No." And this film is kind of reflective of this. There's no particular comedic relief in this. There are some lighter moments and some dark humor moments, but there's not real true comedic moments in this.
But yeah, you can liken it a bit to Heart of Darkness, the journey down the river leading to madness, and of course Apocalypse Now, which came out later and which we read. Apparently this was a fair influence on Apocalypse Now, which came out in the late 70s.
Yeah.
This came out in 1972, but it didn't get a U.S. release apparently until 1977. But a very well thought of, really unique film. Not a lot can be said about the performances other than Kinski's, who pretty much dominates the proceedings.
Yeah. Well, and you told me you were looking at some stats before we started recording. He apparently was paid a third of the budget for the entire film.
Yeah, which was about $370,000.
That was the total budget, so he was paid like $120 or something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. How many times had you seen this prior to today?
I've only seen it once.
Really?
Yeah.
And you remembered it that well?
Yeah.
And regarded it that well from just the one viewing?
Yes, well regarded. I remember being very impressed with it. I looked at my old review, which I wrote of it on my blog, and I gave it 4 stars at that point, and I would give it that again. It's not necessarily the easiest watch, but I think it's a worthwhile watch. And it's a really interesting film. You're seeing things that you're not used to seeing. The ending of the film, basically everybody dies over the course of this expedition, leaving Aguirre alone on the raft, and the raft has become infested with monkeys.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of like king of the monkeys. And it's just such an unusual film. It's a film literacy film. It's very well thought of. It's not that long. It's just over an hour and 30 minutes. So if you're at all interested in this, I would recommend seeing it. There's a lot of articles. I think there may even be a documentary film about the making of this film. So there's a lot of additional material that you can find online and elsewhere to kind of supplement this. This is just a very introductory discussion.
Yeah.
But so I've discussed my feelings on it. What are your feelings, and what would you rate it?
I'm still, I mean, we're recording this within minutes of having ended watching our viewing. I'm still processing this a little bit. My initial reaction, I would say I'd probably give this 3 out of 4 stars on the 4-star scale, and I'd probably give it 7 out of 10 on the 10-star scale. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's a very different film to what probably most American audiences are used to seeing. We talked about the pacing of this film.
Yeah.
It is if you were trying to categorize this movie, it's very much a drama, very heavy on the drama side of it. It's certainly an intriguing film. It's intriguing also to realize what its budget was and kind of what the lengths they went to make the film and things like that. And yeah. Did you talk at all about Werner Herzog's comments about making this and the camera stuff? Did you mention any of that in the recording?
Not on this recording, but he made it with a camera that he stole from a West German art school, and he had some interesting things to say in regarding that. I'll just take a quote here that we found on the Wikipedia page. So he's talking about the camera which he used, which again he stole from the Munich Film School. Years later, Herzog recalled, "It was a very simple 35mm camera, one I used on many other films, so I do not consider it a theft. For me, it was truly a necessity. I wanted to make films and needed a camera. I had some sort of natural right to this tool. If you need air to breathe and you are locked in a room, you have to take a chisel and hammer and break down a wall. It is your absolute right." He's crazy, but he's likably crazy.
Well, and tonight has intrigued me to learn more about Werner Herzog. It's made me intrigued for some of the other films we're going to watch. Part of it is based off of you telling me some of this type of stuff, and then I guess this will could also serve as our transition into the second short film we watched,
which is very much about Werner Herzog, the man.
Yeah.
It is a film from Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe. It's from 1980. Is its release date. I believe it would have been filmed around 1979. It grew out of a bet that Werner Herzog made with a young man named Errol Morris, who was a graduate student in film that he had become acquainted with. And he bet him, so he had this idea to make a film about pet cemeteries. And Herzog said, well, if you make this film, I'll eat my shoe. And he did. He made it into a film which I have seen, a really good movie called Gates of Heaven. It's actually about 2 pet cemeteries, but it's principally about one. There's one that's the more successful of the 2, and then the other one is kind of a family-run operation, and he spends a lot of time talking to the family. And if your family business is pet cemetery, you're a little unusual in the kind of person you are. I mean, that would seem logical. But that's a very good film. It started Errol Morris's extensive film career, which continues to this day. His most recent release was in 2018, a film called American Drama, which is the film about Steve Bannon. I'd heard there was a film about Steve Bannon, but I had forgotten that it was an Errol Morris film.
Yeah.
But he is very well known for this film. Also, The Thin Blue Line, which came out in 1988, which is kind of a predecessor to the true crime drama that's so popular today. He made A Brief History of Time in 91, which is based on the Stephen Hawking book. Stephen Hawking is in the film. Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara. The Unknown Known, which is about Donald Rumsfeld, so he's made 2 films about defense secretaries. But he's a very solid director, and this was his first film, Gates of Heaven. It's an unlikely subject matter for a film to go on to be so well received and to become. I think you could probably say it's more than a cult favorite now. It's really kind of a film literacy film in the school of documentary filmmaking. But Herzog bet that he'd eat his shoe if he made the movie, and he made the movie. So he traveled to California for a screening and proceeded to eat his shoe.
Yeah, and then this film we watched shows him cooking the shoe. And
cooked the shoe for about 5 hours in a pot with various spices.
With a lot of garlic.
A lot of hot sauce, some onions, some rosemary. Duck fat.
And just basically boiled the shoe for 5 hours, and then with a fair amount of persistence proceeds to eat the shoe. Yeah,
so he goes to a screening that night, and it's kind of a Q&A / Werner Herzog eats his shoe event.
Yeah.
This is your first real exposure to him as a man. You've seen his film first. What were your first impressions of Werner Herzog?
He's crazy. He's intriguingly crazy. Obviously, a man who will say something like that and then follow up by actually eating his shoe. There's something going on, but it was, as much as anything else, it was interesting to just listen to him ramble as he ate his shoe.
He's a man of strong opinions.
Yeah.
One of the opinions he voices is that he hates talk shows, which is ironic because he was on Stephen Colbert like last week.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, he's a man who, just listening to him ramble, his opinions, you could tell, would change over time.
Yeah.
But he followed through on his promise, and like I said, he was persistent in finishing that shoe. And I mentioned to Nate, I would probably not want to be Werner Herzog a day or two after he ate that shoe.
Yeah, that shoe's not going to have a pleasant trip down the intestines.
Yeah. But who knows what happened? I mean, they don't mention any of the aftermath afterwards.
No.
So
they do interview him the day after, and he seems perfectly fine.
He seems the same as he was the day before, so yeah.
Hard to rate this one. It's such a novelty, and it's only 20 minutes long.
Yeah, 20 minutes long. I wouldn't really consider that one that we're going to rate. Yeah. I also couldn't find it on IMDb when I was trying to pull it up.
Oh, yeah?
For reference, Aguirre, the Rath of God, has an 8 out of 10 star rating composite score on IMDb. Do you know what its Rotten Tomatoes is by chance?
No, probably 100.
I guess I could look it up real quick.
98% Rotten Tomatoes.
That's interesting. 8 out of 10 on IMDb and 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. So whichever metric you prefer to go by, there's very those high ratings. So, yeah. Anything else to add on this topic?
No, I think that's all I have to say about these films for now. We will be returning to Werner Herzog next week, and for
2 more subsequent weeks.
2 more subsequent weeks, we will be taking a break in between to work on another project. And Herzog's just seems like if you're going to break up any theme month, you might want to break up Herzog because he's a little intense. But yeah, we will return to you in a week's time, which for you will be mere seconds.
Yep, you'll experience a brief pause, as one of my friends on another podcast likes to say.
It is now February the 2nd, 2020. It's a Sunday morning or just a little afternoon because of Super Bowl and other events.
Super Bowl Sunday.
Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay. We reconnoitered and did a Sunday morning vampire film, our second in the Werner Herzog and what's also turning out to be Klaus Kinski month.
Yeah.
The 1979 film Nosferatu the Vampire. This film is a remake of the classic 1922 German silent film featuring Max Schreck. This movie was made in tandem with another film for Herzog, a film called Wozak. These foreign names, I'm sure I'm butchering it. But in order to secure financing, he had 2 films he wanted to make, and he got kind of a 2-for-1 deal. So as soon as they wrapped on this, they had like a long weekend, and then they started production on Wozak the next Monday with some of the same cast and largely the same crew. That film is also based, like this film, is on a 19th century novel. In this case, Dracula, though Nosferatu is a version of the Dracula story that was altered enough for copyright reasons for the original silent film, but then some of the terms and character names were restored for this film because by the late 1970s, Dracula had become public domain. It's quite the movie. This is only the second time I've seen it. The last time I saw it was right around Halloween 2016. This film has a solid reputation. I definitely wanted this to be included in our Herzog month. And I guess what are some of your initial thoughts? Did you know anything about this film going in, and what are your first impressions?
I knew nothing about this film going in. I really was ignorant of Werner Herzog coming into this month. I still am. I intentionally have avoided doing more research into him. I've only looked at things for the movies, after we're watching them. So I didn't look at anything about Aguirre, until after we watched it. I didn't know this was the movie we were watching. Or, well, I guess you probably had mentioned we were watching this week, but I intentionally didn't do any research on it. I'm really impressed with this film. I thought this was far superior to the one we watched last week.
Oh, yeah.
Last week I kind of got lost in the second third of that film.
Yeah.
It kind of wanders. It's the pacing of it is such that I have no criticisms of that film, but I just thought this film was a lot better.
Probably more accessible.
It certainly is more accessible, but I just thought all around it was better executed as well. The pacing in this is still really good, but even at the slower moments, there's little things interjected that keep your interest a little bit better than last week.
I think it's interesting that this is the one you liked more, and I guess I can see it. One of the issues I had with it, and I really liked it, but as we've discussed before, I'll sometimes be distracted by earlier films. And so because this is a remake and takes a lot of the same beats from the silent film, which I had seen previous to this, you couldn't help but think of the original film. Though to my memory, the ending is a fair bit different in this film than in the original silent.
I guess this could lead to a little bit of an interesting discussion topic. You've mentioned that in several of the episodes we've recorded lately, that you default to the earlier versions of films. I guess this has kind of been a thought that's come to me as I sit down and edit these. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the editing process, I end up listening to the entire recording multiple times in the process of editing. It's in snippets, it's back and forth as I'm editing things and then weaving it back together. But as I've listened to Nate, and then listening to the episodes after they're completed, listen to Nate talk about this, I had kind of some thoughts about, you're mentioning that in so many episodes. In terms of audiences, in a lot of instances, the audiences that are seeing films nowadays, in particular something like like Joker, the majority of the audience that's seeing that nowadays is completely oblivious to a lot of these previous versions. I mean, how many people that went and saw the Joker have seen Taxi Driver? And I'm kind of curious, I guess this is kind of a commentary on filmmaking in general. A lot of times we say, well, why are they just remaking stuff? And why aren't they coming up with new thoughts? Sometimes when the source material is so good, it will end up, I think it deserves to be redone multiple times. I mean, how many versions have all of us seen of a Dracula story or vampires in general? And getting back closer to source material, I mean, this was just an excellent film, and it was well composed, it was well thought out. Even though there's changes and different things that are contained in it, this was just a well executed film. And again, I haven't seen the original Nosferatu. Maybe if I saw it, maybe I'd agree with you. But even some of the films where I've seen, like an example would be Arrival, you thought it reminded you heavily of Contact, and you thought Contact was the better film. I thought Arrival stood very well on its own. I guess an even more direct comparison would be something like True Grit. I'm a huge John Wayne, through my grandfather, I'm a big John Wayne fan, and I've seen the original John Wayne True Grit, and while I think that's a great film, and I was really skeptical of them remaking that, I think that the remake really holds up well. Another one where you could make a direct comparison would be something like 3:10 to Yuma. Now, the majority of the remake, I think, is better than the original. A function of that is changes in filmmaking over time. But the ending of the original was superior to the new one, things like that. So I'm kind of curious how this will turn out long term, that kind of take on thinking the original was always better, but you're not necessarily wrong either.
Well, part of that is because the original is inherently going to be more innovative and more original, because it's the original. So I tend to privilege that. But I don't think remakes are necessarily bad. The example of the True Grit, I think those films are pretty close. Like, it'd be hard to choose which is the better. I mean, they're both very complementary and the near equals of one another.
There are also bad examples, like Ghostbusters.
Yeah, exactly. But I understand what you're saying about how modern audiences their interest in films or what they're exposed to is limited. Like I purposely seek out a very wide range of things, and a lot of modern audiences, they see just what's out right now, and they don't go back and see the classics. So it is a way for them to be exposed to some of that material.
Well, and I think in a lot of instances it will even inspire people to go back and see the originals. In terms of introducing somebody to it, I would say probably anybody born after 1980, or the majority of people born after 1980 going into the Joker probably hadn't seen the original. Hadn't seen Taxi Driver, I guess I should say.
Or especially King of Comedy. Even those that have seen Taxi Driver are probably not seen. Because Taxi Driver is kind of a landmark film in a way that King of Comedy is not.
But I would wager anybody born after 1990 probably hasn't even seen Taxi Driver, let alone King of Comedy.
Unless they're an unusually film buff type of person. Going back to vampires, and obviously this is a Dracula story that's been made many, many times. What's your previous exposure to the Dracula story in general?
Dracula story in particular, I'm struggling to recall specific Dracula films outside of like Bram Stoker's. I'm sure that others, if you were to name others off, they would come to me, and things like that. But outside of like Bram Stoker's and a few like that, not very heavily.
Have you seen the Francis Ford Coppola, Bram Stoker's Dracula from the early 90s? I've actually not seen that one.
Oh, haven't you?
No. But I've, of course, seen the Bela Lugosi one from the early 30s and a number of the Christopher Lee Hammer Dracula films.
I guess I've seen a little bit of, or a couple of the Hammer films. I still have a lot of Hammer films to see. I haven't seen a lot of the Hammer films, but I guess I'm familiar with, at least tangentially, some of that through Hammer.
But this is just, as you said, it's a very well-made film. It's beautiful looking. Many of the shots look like they could be 19th century paintings.
Oh, yeah.
The use of the music, classical music, in particular Wagner, in the film is very effective. Just the staging and the casting. This film's got a good cast. Of course, Kinski plays Nosferatu. They really play up the rat-like aspects of Dracula in this film. His makeup is based on the makeup that Max Schreck wore in the 1922 version, with the little rat teeth and the bald, and rats feature much more prominently in this film, I'd say, even than bats do. Bats are present, but here he's much more likened to the disease-carrying rodent than the bat, which is also a disease-carrying rodent. But
I kind of found some notes on the rat parts of this. Are you interested in those? These are largely coming from, or almost entirely coming from IMDb. They're little trivia stuff, but apparently Klaus Kinski had to spend approximately 4 hours a day in makeup. All of the latex earpieces and his other things like that, they were destroyed daily on removal, so they had to be redone every single day of filming. The scene where Nosferatu arrives in the city, they actually used like thousands of rats. They wanted what was referred, or what's the species of gray rats, but they weren't able to get a hold of gray rats. So they, the rats that they used, they just painted white.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then the rats had to all be spayed and neutered before they could use them for filming.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I don't know if you could do that today.
Yeah.
But they got the rats apparently from some sort of research facility. And I guess the customs officer, so they shipped them in. And when the customs officer opened the crate, I guess he passed out when he saw them.
Oh, bet.
But yeah, and then they just everything they had to do with the rats. It seems like quite the crazy process.
Yeah. Well, rounding out the cast, so the guy who plays Van Helsing, and it took me a while to even realize or remember that he was Van Helsing. He's quite good. And the guy who plays Renfell is very appropriately cast, but they're not really names. The only other names in the cast would be Bruno Ganz, who plays Harker. Mr. Ganz passed away late last year. He's perhaps best known for playing Adolf Hitler in the 2004 German film Downfall. He was also in the original Wings of Desire, which was later remade as City of Angels.
Oh, yeah.
He was in The Reader. He was in The Reader? He was in The Reader.
What role did he play in The Reader? Oh, is he let me hurry and look that up. I think I know who he is. He plays Professor Roll in The Reader.
Okay. The law professor, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then he was most recently in A Hidden Life, which came out late last year, which is the Terrence Malick film. The film is pretty faithful to the traditional Dracula story. So Harker is in this case, is a real estate agent. In some cases, he's like a tax person or a librarian. But he travels to Austria. They have this early scene in the very idyllic village where he comes from, which I guess is supposed to be Holland. I mean, he's a German director, obviously, Herzog is, but this is largely filmed in Holland, and it looks like Holland, and it has sea access like Holland would have. But he has to travel cross-country across the Carpathian Mountains to what is today Romania, to where Transylvania is located. He is sent by Redfill, the real estate agent, to negotiate the purchase of a house in their local community by Count Dracula. He's weirded out by Dracula, but he tries to put a good face on it, and eventually realizes what's up, by which point he's been locked in the house in the castle in Transylvania. Dracula has signed the paperwork. He's on his way up north to take possession of his new residence, which is not far from where Harker left his wife, Lucy. Lucy is played by an actress whose name I am almost certainly going to butcher, at least the last name, Isabelle Adjani, who was at one point for about 6 years Mrs. Daniel Day-Lewis. She totally looks like from the first moment you see her in the film, you're like, yeah, she's going to be a vampire because she's got the whole Winona Ryder thing going for her.
She's quite a beautiful lady.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, per vampire lore, Dracula must rest in his native soil, so he fills coffins up with his native soil, puts it on a boat, sends the boat up to Holland. It is overrun with rats that kill basically everybody. He's in there too in one of the coffins.
Yeah.
And he goes out at night and he basically kills off the crew.
Yeah.
So by the time they get
while the ship is sailing.
Yeah, by the time they get into port, they've just got the captain basically tied up to the steering wheel.
Yeah, and he's the only person left on the boat at all.
And they basically float into the canal system more or less on autopilot, inexplicably. The locals are perplexed, very quickly, but not quickly enough, determine that the boat is full of plague-carrying rats. And I love the depiction of the city's descent into chaos.
Yeah.
There's the initial panic, and everybody's kind of hiding, and then the bodies start to pile up, and people are out dealing with the bodies, and you have all these coffins being made, and the bodies being disposed of, and then it just keeps going and going. And the implication, I think, is that the town had been cut off from the outside world to keep the plague trapped there.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly implication of that. I mean, I'm not good enough at geography to know how hard that would be to do. But yeah, there's obvious shots set up where they're self-contained, whether that was done by the outside world or done by themselves. But yeah, that descent into chaos
it's quite something.
Yeah.
A lot of it is filmed in this beautiful old kind of medieval square, and they get a lot of good shots out of that. And there's scenes late in the plague period in which some of the surviving locals are out there dancing and partying, and then they have this elaborate picnic out there, and there's just rats everywhere, and they're just eating their cheese and eating their fruit, and they've gone collectively mad.
Yeah.
And I just think that's probably the most effective part of the movie.
I mean, it's certainly effective. There's a couple scenes, kind of before and after that I really liked. Maybe you're right. Maybe it is the most effective. I feel like the cinematography, like so much of this other movie frames just beautiful. Like you were saying, some of the shots could just be portraits. But I don't feel like the framing is quite as portrait-like in that portion. But yeah, it's an effective scene.
I also liked the scene where Lucy first meets Dracula. He sneaks up behind her, and she's looking in the mirror, and she can see his shadow, but not him. And she's just like puzzled.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, he's right up next to her, and obviously she's startled by this. Obviously, through vampire lore, you cannot see a vampire's reflection, but I don't recall anything being said about his shadow. Yeah. And I just thought that image of the shadow, but nothing generating it in the mirror, was just really effective.
Yeah, it was quite the shot. I really liked that. And then Nosferatu walks up around the side of her, and yeah, I really liked that scene and the framing of it, and yeah, again, framing of this movie, like just framing of shots in every scene of this movie, almost every frame of this movie is just, it's spectacularly done. I mean, this film, my respect for Werner Herzog is going up exponentially through this film.
Yeah, they even have some neat scenes early on when Harker's on his journey to Romania, and he's up in the mountains, and they're just beautiful shots. There's a scene where he's just kind of sitting there on a rock as the sun's starting to set, and there's a scene where maybe they did something to speed up the camera, and you're seeing the clouds go over the moon. That's really effective.
Yeah, it's just very well. The cinematography on this is tremendous.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's very solid. One other thing that probably bears mentioning is the title sequence.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Well, apparently, so I mean, there's just this opening shot of mummified remains in an apparent catacomb.
These are actual people's bodies, dead bodies.
Oh, yeah. And as I looked up some of the filming locations, apparently that was shot down in Mexico. I'm trying to remember the name of the town. Let me look.
And these are bodies of people that had perished in a cholera epidemic there in 1833. And they're kept in the right conditions that kind of leatherize the body.
Yeah.
One thing that's very noticeable is how most of the mouths are wide open.
Yeah.
And I assume that's from the deterioration of the sinews causes the jaws to drop open.
The jaws drop open and then the skin retracts.
The skin retracts and kind of, so it's really creepy.
Yeah, that opening footage of the mummies was filmed in, I'm gonna mispronounce the name of the city, but it's this city state or whatever of Guanajuato, Mexico.
It sets a really interesting tone for the rest of the film.
Yeah. It's very effective, and those shots of the bats that are also interjected throughout the film, they didn't film those slow motion shots of the bats. Those were borrowed from some sort of documentary about bats. So they borrowed those shots from that, but the way that they're interspersed throughout the movie in that opening sequence, it's quite effective. Yeah.
So what are your, I guess, any closing thoughts about the film, and what would you rate it?
Oh, one other scene I wanted to talk about before we get to that. I really liked it, the ending. So Van Helsing goes up. Lucy has basically lured or used herself as a decoy and a trap to
lure,
basically kill Nosferatu or Count Dracula. Van Helsing comes in with a stake and finishes him off. Meanwhile, downstairs, sitting in a corner, like before she's gone to bed that night or gone into her bedroom to lure in Nosferatu, Lucy has used, what was it? You said it was consecrated?
Consecrated, it's communion wafers.
Consecrated
so
wafers.
Harker has made his way out of the castle to go back to warn Lucy, but he had been bitten.
Yeah.
But he's not a full vampire.
He's ill,
and he's got amnesia, so he doesn't remember who she is. And so Lucy basically takes over, and I think this is a big difference from the earlier Dracula versions, because Lucy's basically the hero.
Yeah.
She's the one that pieces together what's going on and does what needs to be done to stop Dracula's plans.
And she recites a couple times at this later part of the movie. She recites a couple times, I don't know whether it's a poem or where it comes from, this thing about a virtuous woman being the only one that could lure Dracula into staying, or Nosferatu into staying out into the daylight, and that's what's going to undo him. So she puts some of the consecrated communion wafers, she breaks some of those up into the coffins on the soil so he can't get into the coffins. And then she goes back to the house, and around Harker, he's sitting in a chair in a corner, and she uses the consecrated communion wafers to create a perimeter around him, almost like a salt line.
Yeah.
And he can't cross that.
So that he can't come up and interfere with her plans.
Yeah, and so he's stuck in the corner, and she exposes herself and distracts Nosferatu into staying the night. The sun comes up, he collapses on the floor. Van Helsing goes up with a stake and finishes him off.
And Van Helsing, there's an interesting take on Van Helsing here, because he's very much a rationalist. He does not believe in the vampires until the very last moment.
Yeah.
And at
I
which
made
point,
the comment as we were watching it, like, this is
his origin
Van Helsing
story
isn't Van Helsing yet.
Yeah.
This is how Van Helsing becomes Van Helsing. And But as this is happening, Harker tells the maid, who has come with Van Helsing and some others to the house, look, you got a job to do. Look at all this stuff on the floor.
Yeah.
And so she starts sweeping aside the consecrated communion wafers, and Harker steps out around her very quickly, like a aha moment, And then we see Harker's nails have started to grow out, like Nosferatu's, and his teeth have changed, and yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of sets up that they haven't really.
This is the perpetuation of the story. I really, really like this film. This film tremendously won me over. In fact, coming into today, I mean, I liked Aguirre. What's the rest of
The Wrath of God.
Aguirre, The Wrath of God. I liked that last week, but because of its slow pace, coming into this morning, I was kind of like, all right, what am I what am I getting into? This film won me over to Werner Herzog.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a 4-star film.
Wow.
Yeah, I loved this.
I'm a big fan of this film. I wouldn't give it 4 stars. I'd give it 3.5. But yeah, it's worth seeing. You got to be prepared for what you're getting into, or well, not necessarily.
Yeah.
But it can help because it is not. I mean, Herzog films, even though this is considerably faster than Aguirre, it's still not super fast. It's not in a hurry to get where it's going.
It's not, but the framing and the composition, the way that the cinematography, the way that so many of those shots, especially the first 2/3 of the film, like you were mentioning as it was going through, I mean, these are just 19th century portraits. A lot of these could be made into paintings. There was a couple shots that I was like, man, how did they get those? Some of the, like the boat. I mean, I assume that had to have been done from a helicopter.
The boat with the beautiful red sails. Love that.
Yeah, it was, but this film it won me over. I don't know if you expected that. I don't know what
No,
you
I
expected.
did not.
I don't know what you expected of my opinion of this film.
Yeah, I didn't think that you'd be that into it, but I'm glad you were.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really good. I really enjoyed this one.
All right. Well, we will be returning shortly with more Herzog. It is February the 11th, 2020. We continue our Werner Herzog month. So far, we have focused primarily on his fictional films, Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Nosferatu, but I definitely wanted to hit some of the documentary work of Werner Herzog because that's really where I first encountered him. I've actually got a kind of interesting story. I guess not really interesting, but I can explain how I came to see this documentary, which we just rewatched for me, first time for Rob, Grizzly Man from 2005. So I was working a job in retail, and there was a section of the store that was furniture, and a section of the store that was electronics. And there was a little station for the cashier in the electronics section. Eventually, they ended up taking that out because there were periods of time where there was nothing going on in the electronics. And I, at the time, subscribed to a magazine called The Week, which was primarily, they would talk about a subject and they would say what different magazines were saying about that subject. And at the end of each issue of The Week, they'd have kind of a larger feature piece. And on a very slow day, I read an article about Timothy Treadwell in the electronics section at work. And I'm like, wow, this is quite the story. And then I heard about the film. So I saw the film when it came out on DVD. It was my first Herzog film. I really, really liked it. It would lead to me seeing some of his other documentaries, principally The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. And after I saw that one, I'm like, well, I really need to see this guy's fictional work. And that's what led into me seeing his dramatic features. So this was the first Werner Herzog film I ever saw, Grizzly Man. Saw it probably 2006, I think. Very shortly after it came out on DVD. It is the true story of a man named Timothy Treadwell, who was an interesting guy, who for the last 13 years of his life became involved in promoting the rights of grizzly bears in the wild. He was the co-founder of an organization called Grizzly People. He was kind of a wannabe actor. He'd had been on Love Connection, I think. I don't know if he'd had any other real acting, but he was a wannabe actor. He had a drug and alcohol problem, and what freed him from that was his love of animals, and he became this activist for grizzly bears And he would go up each summer to a specific spot at a nature reserve near Kodiak, Alaska, and he'd spend the summer there. In his mind, he was there to protect the bears. And the last 5 summers, he brought up a camera, and he would take video of himself and of the bears, and then he would edit this together, and he would show it for free. And they make a point that he did this all, this is not a money-making venture, really, for him. He made just enough to survive.
Well, that's actually not fully clear. It says that he didn't solicit a fee.
Well, he said he didn't solicit a fee for presenting. Now, he may have solicited, like, charging schools and things.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that he didn't accept.
Well, he probably did. I mean, he would have had to have, but it was a nonprofit. Anyway, Treadwell would beat his end on his 13th summer, summer 2003. He brought his girlfriend at the time. His name was Amy. They stayed later than they should have as a result of a dispute over a return ticket. They're like, well, we'll just go back out to the bush for a few more weeks. Major mistake. A starving grizzly bear came upon their campsite and horribly mutilated and murdered Timothy and Amy. And it's a perfect subject matter for Werner Herzog, who's into eccentric people like Treadwell, who's into the wilderness, as we saw in Aguirre. I think it's a really fascinating film. It's a very strong film in my estimation. And now let's hear from Rob, who came into this pretty much blind. You knew nothing of Treadwell. You knew nothing of what this movie was about, really, other than the name.
Yeah, I really didn't know anything about this. And I think in discussing this, I kind of want to discuss it from 2 different perspectives.
Okay.
First, the perspective of Werner Herzog as producing this documentary. Herzog it's obvious through this documentary, he has a great understanding of human nature, just the way people think, the way that he explains kind of some of the things Treadwell's doing, the way he's gotten into Treadwell's thought process. He does a great job of taking Treadwell's footage and editing it and presenting it, but he makes commentary, Herzog narrates the film as well. And at various times he says, this is kind of where Treadwell kind of stumbles off the correct path, and Treadwell kind of contradicts himself here, or, he has some commentary about Treadwell, which is not your standard, I'm an objective documentarian. Yeah. It's obvious Herzog has an opinion, but he also has a deep respect for Herzog. But just the way that he presents this documentary, it's obvious Herzog has a great understanding of human nature. And I appreciated that. The second front in which I'd like to discuss this is Treadwell was not right. He was not necessarily well. You mentioned that he did this as a way to get away from his substance abuse problems, and I don't know how to approach that. I don't know whether he was truly free there towards the end, or if he was having some form of psychosis. I mean, he clearly, those last few videos, was obsessed with his own death, almost like he was planning for this. He talked about that a lot with his family and friends. If I die here, it's fine, blah, blah, blah. But he knew he was pushing the bounds. He'd always left by this time of year, and then he comes back and returns. To what end?
So what they describe is that, I guess Treadwell kept a journal that eventually Herzog was able to get access to. And he describes that after they left at the end of September, they went to the airport and there was a dispute with that, quote, obese airline employee about the ticket. Treadwell, we see him lose his cool a number of times in these videos, and he's almost always alone. And even without people, something can trigger him. And so he just had this big reaction to this dispute about the ticket, and it's like, F this, we're going back out. He was so angry at people that he'd be willing to put his life in danger. He knew this was out of season. He knew that his bears were hibernating. The bears that were coming down to this area are old bears from up in the hills that that are desperate and angry.
The reason they're not hibernating is because they're desperate.
Yeah.
His rants, leading up to this don't necessarily make sense. Like, he's ranting on the Forest Service and as if he's being heavily oppressed and persecuted. And then at the same time, he says that they've flown over twice that entire year.
Mm. Yeah.
So how much opportunity is there for him to be persecuted?
And the extent of persecution he was probably getting from them is like, hey,
you need to follow
Timothy,
these
you need
rules.
to follow these rules for your safety. And if anything, they were being generous in putting up with him out there. He's such an eccentric person, and he was a delusional man.
Yeah, well, and he was. And I have other questions, like there's the couple spots in the, basically one spot in the documentary where he is saying that people are threatening him by leaving these relatively polite notes, and that it's the politeness of it that makes it threatening. And I honestly wonder if he just didn't do it himself for the sake of filming.
So Treadwell would go up to observe the bears, document them for his presentations, and he also felt like he was protecting them. And the area he was at was a nature preserve for the bears, but some people would come. Some fishermen would come.
Well, he would usually move every summer, so he would go for part of the summer to the nature preserve, and then he'd move to the summer.
So he had a general area that he would go to, and then he kind of had a loop that he would make around the area. There was the general preserve part, the more open spaces, and then the part he referred to as the Grizzly Maze, which was very thick with brush.
Yeah.
So he would take that rotation each year. And sometimes people would be there, either from the Park Service or fishermen or people on tour groups, and he would view them as his enemy, that he was the only one that...
He would imply that he was chasing them off sometimes.
Mm. Well, and one of the talking heads, because they interview a number of people in this, the new Treadwell would talk about reports about him going up to people and acting crazy like a bear to scare them off. He was a weird dude.
Yeah. Yeah, the earlier videos, he seems maybe a little off, a little too interested. He honestly seems like some of these guys that you now see on like the Discovery Channel. Mm. But the last year that he's out there, something is clearly different in him. He seems a little unhinged, and he, to some extent, seems bent on death. Mm. And
well, that's one of the things that his girlfriend says, that one of the last entries in his journal is he records an argument he had with his girlfriend, who reluctantly came back out with him the second time after season. And she said something about him being hell-bent on destruction.
Yeah.
You can see where she comes from, because, it's fascinating. He's a fascinating character. Some of the people around him are kind of fascinating. They're all kind of eccentrics. A lot of them are granola.
Yeah.
He's had a number of women that he had relationships with. Not always romantic, but some of them romantic. There's one woman named June who had been an employee of his at Grizzly People, who had also worked with him in some another capacity. They met working at a kind of a medieval times type place called Gulliver's. And then they'd been boyfriend, girlfriend for a while, and they stayed close. Seems like he stayed close with a lot of people that pop up in this. And then you also have people that didn't necessarily know him directly, like that coroner. I kind of love the coroner because he's so odd and broad in his presentation when he's recounting what happened to Treadwell and the autopsies.
He's very dramatic.
He is dramatic, and I kind of like that, because if you'll see this in some of the other Werner Herzog films, especially the documentary, that when he sees somebody that's just a little off, he's like, oh, I'm fascinated by that person. I'm going to interview that person and spend more time with that person, because there's just the flavor of that unique personality. And this guy's like a county coroner or something up there, and he's a unique...
See, I interpreted that a little bit differently, and this is probably largely through the lens of me listening to a lot of true crime podcasts and things like that. When you get a coroner who takes it upon themselves to be eccentric like that, they're usually not doing their job correctly. Mm. Obviously this guy enjoyed his moment in the spotlight with Herzog. it, for me, it draws into question whether they're doing their job correctly. I mean, he's giving a recitation of facts that I don't think he's twisting anything there, but you have, in particular in Alaska, you have other examples of, specifically, I'll use a specific example, Israel Keys, who was a serial killer who was in Alaska for a long time. Someone similar who was a prosecutor ends up sabotaging the entire prosecution of Israel Keys and makes mistakes that allow Israel Keys to commit suicide before the FBI finishes getting information from him and actually figuring out who he did and didn't kill, because this prosecutor screwed the pooch with a very similar attitude to what this coroner's demonstrating. And so I interpreted the coroner a little bit differently than you were. I wasn't fascinated by the coroner. I was disturbed by the coroner.
Disturbed by the coroner. Yeah.
There's
a few pretty straight. There's this ecologist couple that they talked to that were friends with Treadwell, but they definitely recognized that Treadwell was a little out there.
Yeah.
There's this one expert in bears that they interview a few times, and Kodiak talks about the sustainability of the population, and he's pretty objective.
Yeah.
And then the guy that flew the
pilot. I loved the pilot.
Probably my favorite character in quotes in the film.
I didn't like the women that Herzog was interviewing per se. In particular, Jewel.
Or Jewel. Yeah.
Jewel Pelovac just was a little
she
too odd.
Was, yeah, she's an odd.
Kathleen Parker was okay
until
the end, and then when they went to spread the ashes, she was
very granola up there.
A little bit loony, but Jewel seemed a little kooky to me. The pilot, I thought, was, because he seemed objective, he seemed very honest, he wasn't sensationalizing things, just, here's the facts, and the pilot was fascinating, and I loved that scene towards the end when they're flying out and he's singing the song.
Yeah.
Oh, I liked that part.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really the closest to Herzog in being kind of an objective.
Yeah.
A more or less objective navigator who sees things pretty
But he also
accurately.
knew
him, liked him.
Yeah,
liked working with him.
Treadwell very well.
But
flew him in and out several times. Would check on him.
Knew his eccentricities and.
Well, and he's the one that discovers him because he comes to check on him and
he comes to pick him up, and he's not there at the pickup site, and so he flies around and he sees. He's exploring first.
Tries to hike and then realizes a bear's following him.
Sees the crazy bear, gets freaked out, goes back onto his plane, flies around to try to kind of scare the bear off to see if he can get a sense what's going on, and actually sees the bear eating a human torso.
Yeah.
And realizes what happens, gets in touch with the authorities that send more people up there. They eventually have to kill the bear. And then they are able to find remains of Timothy and his girlfriend in the bear's stomach. And then they find the campsite, they find the video, the journals, the other artifacts.
Yeah, it was... I guess this is a little bit morbid curiosity on my part, but I kind of wanted to hear those final tapes. But at the same time, I don't.
They have a great scene where they talk about the tapes. So when the bear attacked the tent at night,
talks about it while he's listening.
So what ended up happening to Treadwell and the girlfriend is they're attacked by a starving bear in their tent at night, and Treadwell is able to turn on the video camera to record it, but he doesn't have an opportunity to remove the lens cap. So they said that the process was about 6 minutes. That it happened really quick. And so the audio was preserved. Eventually, this
was it in
VHS
the
recorder.
Because they talked about her being able to get a pot and beating the bear over the top.
No,
of the head
I'm
with
pretty
pot.
sure they would have had to have been in the tent.
I didn't catch whether it was at night or if it was during the day. I thought it was kind of during daytime.
My impression I got, I'm pretty sure it was at night, because that would explain why they were in the tent and why it was a surprise thing. But I could be wrong. But that's the impression I got from it. But anyway, somehow or another, they turn on the video cassette recorder with the lens cap on, so it captures the audio. This ends up in the possession of
the authorities,
and then eventually
the coroner, and
Julie,
then to the family. Yeah.
And there's a scene where is Jules or Julie? Jewel. So Jewel is there, the ex-girlfriend and employee of Timothy Treadwell, is there while Herzog is listening to it. And there's a certain point at which, and you can't see Herzog's face, you can see Jewel's face.
Yeah.
And she sees something in his face, and she starts breaking down. And Herzog says, you must never listen to this tape, and you must never see the photographs that I saw at the coroner's office. And in fact, you should destroy the tape, because otherwise it'll be the white elephant of your life. It'll be sitting there on a shelf, and you'll always be like, at any time I could hear this if I chose to. If I had somehow ended up with the tape, I don't think I ever would have listened to it, but I don't think I would have destroyed it.
I don't think I would have destroyed it either.
I would have just kept it.
Yeah. I mean, this was a fascinating documentary.
It's really different, too. Can you think of anything like this that you've seen before in terms of his style? And
No. I think I've probably seen style before, similar styles before, but not when it comes to this type of subject matter. You know, you see this type of style sometimes with people that do documentaries about Native Americans and things like that, but not about this type of topic.
He's very into survival stories. So he did a documentary called Little Dieter Wants to Fly about a kid who was born in Germany, ended up in the United States, ended up in the Air Force, was shot down in Vietnam, and was a prisoner in Vietnam for years. Eventually got out and became an airline pilot. And he was so fascinated with this story that he later made a dramatic film, I think it was called Rescue Dawn, if I remember correctly, about this story. So he made the documentary, then he made the movie. There's another documentary he made that I have not seen, and I'm forgetting its title, about a plane crash, and one woman survived, a stewardess. And he did a documentary about her. So these people, and even Aguirre, the Rath of God, is about a group of people that all die. Yeah. And so he's fascinated by those who survive and those who die, and where you get to these situations that end tragically like this, or occasionally the person that miraculously escapes the tragedy. It's a through line in his work, and it's very much on display here.
Yeah. This really was fascinating. I'm really impressed by this. I'm quickly becoming a fan of Werner Herzog. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to have to seek more of this out on my own after this month is over.
Yeah, definitely see. I mean, I like the dramatic work, but the documentaries are a little more accessible.
Yeah, I liked Aguirre, but I liked Nosferatu exponentially better. And I liked this documentary at least as much, if not more, than I like Nosferatu. So I'm curious to see where we're going next week. I don't know if you intentionally built this way or anticipated my reactions to this in this manner, but we're building in a very satisfying
arc so far, yeah. I was going to just touch briefly, so they talk a little bit about Treadwell's boyhood. He grew up in Long Island. He was one of 4 brothers, kind of working class. His parents eventually retired to Florida. His last name wasn't originally Treadwell. Treadwell is a family name, probably some kind of maternal family name. But the last name, no, there it is. It's Dexter. His last name was Dexter. And then he turned it to Treadwell when he went out to California. And they talk a little bit about his obsession, him and his mom's obsession with animals. They had a pet squirrel, his obsession with bears, teddy bears that he had as a kid. And it feels like whatever caused him to be who he was had to be somehow related to childhood. But you don't get a good sense of why, his trajectory. Why was Timothy Treadwell like that? When did he become truly unhinged?
One of the unanswered questions I have is when he would leave Alaska and go, quote-unquote, home, he was going back to California. And they mentioned that in the documentary. He was going back to California, and they don't say what part of California, but what do most people go to California for? They go there for show business. And I can't help but think Treadwell was likely trying to sell this or sell himself to some sort of cable channel to make, we see these videos now, these people that go and live in Alaska. In fact, Joe Rogan recently interviewed one guy who lived in Alaska and, had his family up there and did several seasons of a show for the Discovery Channel and this and that and the other. I can't help but wonder if this isn't what Treadwell was going for, but he could never get the execs to give him a contract, and that's what led to some of his angry rants at unspecified people in society. And
Yeah, and he's clearly unstable. Anybody that spent much time with him would be like, I don't know if we want to enter into a long-term business relationship with this person.
even a short-term relationship with this guy.
But he did become something of a celebrity even before his death. They had the interview with, what's his name, the Dateline NBC guy.
I didn't remember him.
Yeah,
And
I
then he
don't.
also
I
has
don't think
David
you recognize
Letterman
that. And then there's a reference to he was on David Letterman. It'd be fun to track down. It might well be on YouTube to see a clip of him on Letterman.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a fascinating story. It's a tragic story. It's a unique story. It's a really solid documentary. It's what got me into Werner Herzog films. I would give this 4 stars. I think it's excellent. There's hard to think of anything really that like it.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah, I'm impressed by this.
So we will be back for our final Herzog film momentarily. It is February the 25th, 2020, and we are wrapping up Werner Herzog month. There was a little change of plans. My original intention was to end this month with Fitzcarraldo. And recording the last episode, Rob mentioned how this is just getting better and better, building up. And I'm like, maybe I don't want to end it on Fitzcarraldo just because that, as much as I like it, because that kind of takes us back to some territory we've kind of covered. Like Aguirre, Fitzcarraldo is another tale of madness in the jungle, starring Klaus Kinski. So I thought a good way to end this, because we've done 2 of his dramatic films, Herzog's, and it would be to do 2 documentaries, and let's maybe end this on My Best Fiend, which is a film that Herzog did about Klaus Kinski, his tortured muse after Kinski's death. However, that did not arrive in time from the old school Netflix DVD.com. But I did have another Herzog documentary, which I had not yet seen, and I thought it would be neat to watch a Herzog movie together that I had not previously seen. So tonight we watched a film about everybody's favorite communist, Mikhail Gorbachev, in Meeting Gorbachev. This film was released theatrically just last year, 2019. It is basically an examination of the life of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last premier of the Soviet Union. Herzog and him had 3 different meetings over the course of, I think, the better part of a year, 6 months to a year. And then this is supplemented, of course, with archival footage and other interviews and things of that nature. Just an overview of the life of really one of the great men of the 20th century. And you get to hear his personal thoughts on things. I thought that of the Herzog films that we've seen, and also of the Herzog documentaries, which I've seen, which obviously is more than you've seen, in some ways this was the most conventional and least interesting subject matter. Because anybody could have made a film about this. I mean, it's a very safe documentary subject. Now, Herzog puts a spin on it, and there's some things in it, especially visually, that he does that are a little different, and then you got to love his narration. He's got this great voice for that kind of thing. Part of it felt a little padded, especially towards the beginning, and he was trying to figure out ways to make things visually interesting, so he had those drone shots of like the cemetery where most of Gorbachev's family is buried, and of some law school he went to.
In the village.
And I just thought, it's okay, but it did feel a little forced. So again, this is the most conventional Herzog film we've seen by far, but it's still a fascinating film because the subject is a fascinating man.
You know, I made a comment a little bit to my wife. This is totally a new comment to you because I made it to my wife before I came over earlier tonight. Herzog's documentaries are a little bit different than your traditional documentary. Yeah. You usually don't have the director also narrating and inserting themselves as at least a partial subject of the film.
And that's
which is apparently his style in his documentaries. So it totally separates him style-wise from a lot of other documentarians and makes his documentaries different to start with. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that's a key difference in his documentaries. And it's kind of interesting. I've kind of reflected on this since we watched Grizzly Man. You told me it was a documentary. And then there's so much of Herzog interjecting. Because usually, the director is presenting information to you. They're not sitting there narrating it as they go and telling you their thoughts and feelings on it. That's not what you usually get out of a documentary, and that's what you get out of Herzog. And so like I said, stylistically, it's so different. It's interesting. It's an interesting approach to it. And I like these. I like the Herzog documentaries, the two that I've seen now, but I'm not sure how to compare it to other documentaries.
Well, I guess the obvious point of comparison would probably be Michael Moore, who is very much... You've never seen a Michael Moore documentary? Really?
No.
Not even out of morbid curiosity?
No.
We're going to have to do a Michael Moore documentary at some point just to expose you to him.
There's one that I would like to see. I kind of want to see his one on Columbine. Outside of that, they've never appealed to me. It's not an opposition to Michael Moore. It literally doesn't appeal to me. So
that's interesting, because I was more used to this by virtue of the Michael Moore documentaries, and I disagree with Michael Moore on many things politically, but he is a compelling filmmaker. He's interesting, as is Herzog. He's much more polemical than Herzog is, but you're right. Herzog does inject himself. One of the first things he says to Gorbachev in the interview is like, "I love you," because reunification of Germany was so important to me.
Yeah.
And we're so well, in Germany, we're really well disposed towards you because you allowed it to happen and the way you allowed it to happen.
Yeah, at that point, Herzog kind of talks for a little while about, I guess this is kind of where you start with his personal interjections on Mikhail Gorbachev. He talks about how Gorbachev relates the story of the first Germans that he knew, and Herzog comments on how he wondered if this was just...
Because he has a very positive story about the first Germans he knew as a child. Herzog had made the educated guess that the first Germans you knew were probably trying to kill you, and he says, no, they were chocolate gingerbread makers in the home village I grew up in. It would come from Germany, and I loved them because they made gingerbread.
Yeah, but Herzog makes a personal interjection almost right away, talking about how genuine Gorbachev is. He had made these assumptions, and he wonders if Gorbachev is saying these things for Herzog's benefit and for the benefit of the documentary. But he immediately goes into this kind of, not super long, but a prolonged explanation of how he came to believe Gorbachev was just that genuine, and he means everything he says. And that kind of caught me off guard. That story of Gorbachev talking about the Germans was interesting. And it's a somewhat logical conclusion that Herzog had come to, that the first Germans he met probably didn't like him, wanted to harm him, because that portion of World War II was just such a rough portion of World War II. A lot of Americans are really ignorant to how long that went on, the front against the Soviet Union, and how it affected so much of the Soviet Union. Just the average citizen of the Soviet Union was so affected by it. A lot of Americans are ignorant of that, and so it's a reasonable assumption for Herzog to have made. And so then for the direction it takes, and then for Herzog to interject like that, it sets the tone kind of right from the beginning.
So Gorbachev, of course, is a very significant figure. Our childhoods correspond with Gorbachev's presidency. I guess going into it, what were your thoughts on Gorbachev, or what did you know about him, and what were you expecting out of this?
I only recalled a certain amount about Gorbachev. Like you said, a lot of this occurred during our childhood, so I remember a lot of the occurrences, a lot of the events that are discussed, but I didn't have the same context on those memories. I'd never actually sat down and thought about them, in the context that they're presented in this film.
But like the basic overview of his biography, I was in broad outlines familiar with what that was. I knew roughly where he was from. I knew that he started out as an agriculture official, and I knew about the string of deaths of Soviet leaders in the early 80s, that eventually they decided, we can't keep appointing old men.
Yeah.
Here's a very charismatic, dynamic young man. I guess he would have probably been in his mid-50s. At that time, he was born in 1931, and he came into power in 1985. He was a bold choice, and he made bold decisions, which were really called on by the time and place that he found himself in power. He was a believer in communism, but he also recognized its faults and wanted to reform it. And ultimately, those two things did not work well together. And so he engineered unintentionally the peaceful demise of the Soviet Union.
Well, and I had a kind of a satirical comment on something you said earlier. You referred to him as our favorite communist. And my satirical comment was something along the lines of, well, given some of the choices that he made and what happened afterwards, can you really call him our favorite communist? Because essentially it led to the end of the Soviet form of communism, which is not necessarily the point of this documentary, though, either. You were probably more familiar with Gorbachev and his life coming into this than I was. I was familiar with the occurrences. I remembered the names of the leaders who came right before him. I didn't recall the years of their deaths, the proximity of them, those types of things. But then I was familiar with a lot of the events that occur within Gorbachev's, presidency and things like that.
Well, Chernobyl, which of course got a lot of recent publicity with the HBO series.
Yeah, and I was probably a little more familiar with Chernobyl than the average person even prior to that miniseries. But that miniseries and the companion podcast that they produced alongside it was very interesting. Yeah, and it covered, they got into a lot of great source documentation for that documentary on HBO. So,
well, I'm one of
my
my
documentary, but miniseries.
Yeah. Well, an area of interest that I've had for a long time has been the late Soviet period, from probably the late 70s to the dissolution of the USSR in 1992. I just find that absolutely fascinating. There's a really good documentary that Showtime did a few years ago about Billy Joel's trip to the Soviet Union in 1987-ish. One of the first Western rock musicians allowed to tour the Soviet Union. And that was really fascinating to see this whole people, because of Gorbachev, because of their leadership, easing things, having their first encounter with this kind of Western world, or at least their first allowed encounter with Western popular culture like this. And the kind of a tentative aspect at first, and then this full-on embrace, and how quickly that happened. I really think that the end of the Soviet Union and the years leading right up to it, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it is just some of the most inspiring stuff that's ever happened. And that it worked out as well as it worked out is amazing. And so much of that, the bulk of that credit goes to Mikhail Gorbachev for not fighting it once he saw what was coming and knowing it's like there's no point in clamping down like some of my predecessors did. One other thing I found interesting about this documentary, especially in relation to the end of the Cold War, is how very little Reagan is in it. There's almost no Reagan in it. They talk about the conference in Reykjavik and a few things, but he's hardly in it. And later on, Gorbachev talks about how the Americans went to their head, this idea that they won. Yeah. It's like they didn't win. We both won. And it was interesting to see that approaching this story with Reagan as very much a side figure and not the central figure to it.
I can see why you would want to do something like that. Again, this comes back to popular U.S. narratives. The U.S. narrative of World War II is that America came in and won the war, especially the war in Europe. In particular, Russia had really been fighting Germany in World War II for a long time before the U.S. got involved. And that Soviet front, of that war with Germany was so traumatic. It was so stretched out. It was so prolonged. There's a real... The Americans tend to ignore the Soviet contributions. I mean, how often were U.S. and Soviet leaders meeting with Churchill, and things like that? That happened a lot. It was all done in secret, and the way that the Soviets and the U.S. worked together in the aftermath of beating Germany, the U.S. could not have won that war without the Soviet contributions to World War II. Simply couldn't have. So then for Americans to have the popular narrative that America just showed up and won the war is somewhat offensive to Soviets.
Yeah,
and that's dealt with in other popular media and things like that. And then you have that same kind of narrative about the Cold War. America dominated and won the Cold War. And that's the common and popular narrative within U.S. culture.
Yeah.
And
America
that's not
comes
necessarily
in,
the case.
makes things happen, whereas the Russian narrative of both World War II and of the dissolution of the Cold War would have been of steady perseverance.
Yeah.
And kind of suffering through it and taking time and making it happen, not this triumphalism that you would see from the American perspective.
Yeah. And that's kind of interesting to have those, to view those in this kind of format, so you can see why it would be easy, why Herzog would have made the choice to focus more on the Soviet perspective. I think he, in this treatment of it, he is a little favorable to the Soviet side of things, but it's probably a better, more balanced narrative than the traditional U.S. narrative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's very partial to Gorbachev.
Yeah.
More so, I would say it's pro-Gorbachev more so than it's pro-Soviet.
That would be accurate. Yeah.
There was some interesting things hearing Gorbachev's perspective. One of the more interesting ones was the bad blood between him and Yeltsin. Yeltsin's been dead for, I think he died in 2007. So he's been dead for 10 plus years at the time they recorded these interviews. And he still hasn't forgiven him. And I understand why. I even go so far as to say maybe I should have sent him away somewhere. And it was just like, oh, that's very old school Soviet of you, Mikhail.
Well, the two things that he said that I thought was the most interesting to me was, one, how defensive he still was about Chernobyl, and two, how critical he was of Margaret Thatcher. He didn't really seem to like Margaret Thatcher. They respected each other, but he didn't seem to like her.
Well, and also the story he tells about Helmut Kohl, the West German chancellor, is like he said that he compared me to Goebbels.
Yeah.
And Herzog's like, oh, I want to apologize. And Gorbachev's like, no big deal, but we're good friends now. It's like, but the first impressions were rough. But he was one that, there's that famous quote that they even play the audio of from Margaret Thatcher, where she says, I met him and I knew this is somebody we could do business with. And that's what she relayed to Reagan.
Yeah.
Saying, don't just dismiss this guy. He's the real deal. You guys can make some serious progress on any number of issues.
Yeah, which ultimately they did. I one of the perspectives that Gorbachev had that I respected a lot was his perspective on nuclear disarmament. That's considering the nature of the Cold War, that's a pretty unexpected stance for him to have taken. Even today, that could be considered somewhat progressive.
Yeah, and he brings it into the present day, and he talks about how a lot of those Soviet-American nuclear deals that he negotiated with Reagan and George H.W. Bush have been basically rejected. They're being reversed. And his concern about the occupant of the Oval Office in America and about Putin, that he's not cool with what both of them are doing in terms of the nuclear situation. And it was neat to see both him and then interview George Shultz, who was one of Reagan's Secretary of States, and James Baker, who was one of George H.W. Bush's, looking back at it and just thinking how horrible this is and how depressed they are, considering how much effort they put into making these things happen, and that 25 years later, people have already forgotten.
Well, one of the other thoughts I kind of had about this was considering how progressive Gorbachev was, how the Soviet Union has kind of regressed a little bit under the leadership of people like Putin. I'm not going to limit it just to Putin, but because of name familiarity, that's the only name I'm going to mention right here. But, given what Gorbachev did and his stances and leanings and things like that, you could make the argument that the Soviet Union has regressed a little bit since that time. Especially on the fronts of like nuclear disarmament. So
yeah, but yeah, I thought this is a fascinating film. It presents Gorbachev as what I think he is, which was a very well-meaning person who's ultimately a tragic figure.
It might be a little bit of a rose-colored view of Gorbachev, but I don't think it's far from the truth.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some dirt in there that we don't have. I mean, if you survived politically in the Soviet Union at that time, who knows?
Well, like I mentioned, Gorbachev was really defensive about Chernobyl, and Herzog allows him just to totally gloss over Chernobyl, and then he, shows some stock footage and some, just to give some narrative about Chernobyl, but really no critical assessment of Gorbachev and how that was handled. Granted, a lot of that was beyond Gorbachev's control, but it had a lot to do with the system that was placed, and Gorbachev was the head of the system at the time. So to allow him to skate on that is a little bit rose-colored, in my opinion. There are criticisms that could be made of Gorbachev at the time. He could have instructed people to clarify things sooner, things like that. But it's not an unreasonable response, and a way to address it in the documentary, because that's not the subject of the documentary. But for as historical of an event as that was, for it to be treated as lightly as it was in the documentary, I was a little surprised.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I can imagine there was a lot more material left on the cutting room floor. The DVD is very simple. It just says the theatrical trailer and the movie. But it would have been interesting to have access to deleted scenes and stuff from this and see if they got into more detail about some of these things.
The way that they discuss it, or at least the way it's done on the presented in the documentary, I don't think they went too much further into it. I think if Gorbachev was really defensive about something, Herzog kind of shied away from it. So the way that he reacted to Herzog's questions about Chernobyl, I suspect that we got a good chunk of what material was there.
Well, I quite enjoyed this. I would recommend it, especially if you're interested in the man and interested in the period in which he was in power. It's a good overview. For me, a lot of it was kind of repetitive, but those moments in which you're able to get his take on these events were often revealing. I would probably give this film probably 3.5 stars. Maybe
I'd
7
probably
stars on a 10-star scale.
We're pretty close. I'd probably give it 3 out of 4 stars, but I'd also give it 7 out of 10 stars on the 10-star scale. Again, like you, I like this film. I would recommend it. I'm kind of curious. So now, of the 4 Werner Herzog films we watched for this episode, how would you rank the 4?
How would I rank the 4? I think Grizzly Man has to be number 1.
Really?
Yeah. That was the film that introduced me to Herzog, and I just think it's pretty close to a perfect documentary. It's such a fascinating subject. And then I would probably put Aguirre second, and then probably Nosferatu, and then probably the Gorbachev movie.
Yeah, we're in agreement on Gorbachev being towards the bottom of the list. I'm really torn between Nosferatu and Grizzly Man being the top for me, but those are certainly 1 and 2 for me. Actually, I think I would put this third, and I'd put Aguirre fourth. I enjoyed that film. It was interesting. I'm glad we did it first, because I think if we had done it later in the series, I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you've seen something like Nosferatu, so if as you listen to this podcast, if you find yourself agreeing with me more than Nate, if you find yourself in the scenario of having seen Grizzly Man or having seen Nosferatu, probably don't go see. In my opinion, don't go see Aguirre. I think that was probably the weakest of the month for me. I do think this one probably sits in third, and for me, Aguirre sits in fourth.
Well, I would say Aguirre is definitely worth seeing. It is a film literacy film.
Yeah.
Very well received. It kind of, he splashed on the scene with that, and so much of what came after the genesis is his way of making films, his point of view is
That's
really captured in Aguirre, which is only about an hour and a half long. So it's not a particularly long set. A lot of his later German films can be longer.
Yeah.
And maybe a little tougher sit, but yeah, I would recommend any of the films that we watched.
I would agree. And I'm probably going to now go seek out more Werner Herzog.
Yeah, I was going to ask about
I wanted to go seek out more earlier this month when I had a little viewing time. But I was like, no, I don't want to spoil the rest of the episode. But now that we're concluding this episode, I'll probably go seek out more Werner Herzog.
Probably.
I kind of want to see more of his documentaries, and I want to see more of his dramatic films. But I will steer more towards those like Nosferatu.
I've not seen any of his dramatic films which he made in English. He made a film called Bad Lieutenant Port of Call, New Orleans with Nicolas Cage. He made a film called My Son, What Have You Done with Michael Shannon. and William Dafoe and Grace Zabriskie. So I do want to see some of his English language fiction films, but I also want to see more of his German fiction and documentary films. So that should do us for Werner Herzog month. Thought this would be a little bit of a slug for you potentially, but I'm glad that you enjoyed it as much as you did.
Yeah, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed, in particular, Nosferatu. Grizzly Man is it's an accessible film. Let's put it that way. But I was surprised by how much I enjoyed Nosferatu. For me, that was probably the surprise of these. But yeah, I really enjoyed this month. Yeah, Werner Herzog is very strong. I'm gonna have to spend some time reviewing more of his filmography so I can pick out some others to go and watch. So yeah. He has kind of an interesting arc in terms of what all he's done.
Yeah,
there's a wide range between
exactly.
his fiction and his more serious dramas, and yeah.
Well, that should do us for this month. For the next month, we're probably going to do a few kind of shorter standalone episodes due to some scheduling and other events that are happening in March. We won't do an overarching theme.
Yeah, we won't really have a themed episode for March. It'll just be standalones.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but we'll let you know more about those as we know more about them ourselves. But for now, signing off, this has been Nate.
And I'm Rob. And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. So one of the other stories I was going to mention, kind of in line with what you were talking about with Billy Joel. Mm-hmm. I've mentioned this biography a lot, and so someday you're probably going to have to read it. The Billy Crystal biography, autobiography. I don't know why I keep making that mistake. But the Billy Crystal autobiography, he recorded, I don't recall if it was a Showtime or HBO special in Moscow. Mm-hmm. And kind of what you were talking about with Billy Joel going over to the Soviet Union. Billy Crystal's recollection of going to Moscow to film his special.
This was back during the Soviet era?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was in the 80s. I'd have to look up the exact dates and things like that. But he goes and he had the Soviet minders and things like that. Mm-hmm. And he said it was actually one of the most awkward specials that he ever recorded because this location, wherever they filmed it, was filled with all these Russian people. And so he'd tell jokes. And they would look at his minders to see if it was okay if they could laugh at the jokes, And so he said it was kind of awkward because there was these delayed reactions to everything that he did and everything he was saying, and I guess a certain amount of the audience noise was just cut out of what was aired and things like that because they weren't reacting correctly. But he had to go on like they'd reacted like a U.S. audience would react, but yeah, to hear Billy Crystal talk about trying to do a comedy special in Moscow during the old Soviet Union. Yeah, that was an interesting story.
So Spalding Gray, who was a famous monologuist and also an actor, traveled in the late 80s to the Soviet Union with a bunch of other entertainment people for a film festival. And he brought with him his film Swimming to Cambodia, which is basically just him at a desk talking for an hour and a half. So they get there to put it on, only to discover that it has not been translated into Russian. And it's just him talking at a desk. So they tried for a little while for him to kind of summarize things and then realized this isn't happening. So let's just go straight to the Q&A. So somebody raises their hands and it's yes, what is your question? I was wondering why for in movie Tootsie does Dustin Hoffman dress as woman? And Spalding Gray's you'd have to ask Dustin.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating, the idea of this people, the Russian people, that they can ask questions, they can see just this tentative things. In the Billy Joel documentary, he talks about how these tickets were hot items in the Soviet Union to go see Billy Joel, and so a lot of them went to uppity up people, and so some of the younger people that were aware of his music, often not quite legally, didn't get the good seats, and he's doing one of his first shows, and the audience, he's getting nothing from the audience, which he's not used to. And so he invites, if anybody wants to come up front and dance and hang out, come on up. All these young people rush up to the front. They knew his music.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have known his music. And really got into it. And that's when things started to take off, where they realized we can do this. We have the freedom to dance and to to express our enjoyment of this decadent Western music.
Yeah. I pulled up his filmography, and I'm kind of curious to talk about some of this, like just the difference and different things that are here. I don't know how many of these you're familiar with in terms of some of these documentaries and other titles.
Cave of Forgotten Dreams is very good. I would highly recommend that. I wanted to actually show it this month. I have a copy, but it's back up in Boise, so I didn't have.
I've heard the name Encounters at the End of the World, but I didn't realize it was documentary. Of course, Rescue Dawn.
Rescue Dawn I've seen.
Yeah.
That actually is an English language fiction film about some POWs in Vietnam. It's quite good.
Yeah. And then you had mentioned, where did it go? Oh, Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans. That'd be kind of interesting to see. I actually saw that somewhere recently.
There's another Bad Lieutenant film. I think they're in
with
a very
Nicolas Cage.
No, I think somebody else, and I think it's the loosest of franchises.
I swear I saw a poster for a Nicolas Cage.
Well, that's
Bad Lieutenant film recently.
That's the Port of Call, New Orleans. That's the.
So I saw that movie somewhere recently, but yeah, it's interesting just how these are interspersed. You know, how he'll do a few regular films, then a series of documentaries, and yeah.
So one story that I was planning on sharing if we did Fitzcarraldo is a story about the first time I saw it, which was, I think, 2017. I rented it through DVD.com. And when I watch foreign films, I generally like to watch them in the language in which they were traditionally filmed, in which they were shot. So when I got the DVD, I put it on the German audio track with the English subtitles.
Yeah.
I watch it. It's pretty good. And I definitely want to see it again, which I'll probably do in the next couple weeks, because it is on Amazon right now. But after I watched it, I'm like, I want to learn more about this film. It was an interesting film. So I turn on the audio commentary. In the first couple of minutes of the audio commentary, Werner Herzog says, well, we were, filming, and we had the international cast. We had Spanish speakers, we had English speakers, German speakers, and it just came to be that most of us spoke English more than anything else. And so even though I had written the script in German, we just translated it really quick in English, and we filmed it in English. And I'm like, wait a minute. I just watched a 2 hour and 37-minute film that actually was filmed in English with the German audio track and English subtitles over it.
Yeah. Which means the German was entirely dubbed.
Yeah, the German was entirely dubbed. And
Did you
I
notice?
Didn't notice it because I knew that a lot of these films, especially international European films, I don't know if they do it so much now, but in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they would film people just speaking whatever language they spoke, and then they just dub it over.
Kind of the spaghetti western system.
The spaghetti western system, yeah. And so I assumed something like that would probably have happened with the film, but none of the major stars were native English speaker, because you had Kinski was German and Claudia Cardinelli was Spanish, so I figure they're speaking German.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to seeing it soon in the original English.
That's funny.